About Mute, everybody. Right now, Netflix, it seems like they're trying to pick up all these movies that seem like the big studios are kind of passing on because they think there's going to be a big failure. Now, that can actually be pretty good if the movies actually turn out to be really well received. But if they kind of turn out to be a bust, you start to realize maybe these studios had a reason for kind of passing on the property, right? Just to begin with. Now, we have Mute, which is a Netflix movie coming out. Obviously, it came out today. Few hours ago, directed by Duncan Jones. Now, I don't think anybody's going to say Duncan Jones is a bad director. He's actually a pretty great director. People really enjoy Moon. People really enjoy, Source Code. People kind of enjoy Warcraft. I enjoyed it, and so did China pretty much, but that's kind of nor here nor there. Now he has a movie coming out on Netflix, and then it's been an idea he's been trying to get going for quite some time. Now, everybody's kind of comparing this thing, at least visually, to like Blade Runner, or even Total Recall for the most part. But the problem is when you kind of compare movies to those things, you got to realize Blade Runner is not just, or even Total Recall, it's not just a visually stunning movie. And like it is, but there's a lot more to Blade Runner, whether it be 2049 or whatever it may be. There's a lot more to it than just a visual style. There, you got to go deeper into it, and there's a lot more higher meaning. The visuals catch your eye, but once you go inside the world, there's a lot more to say than just like, oh, look, flashing lights. And that's kind of where Mute difference. There's a big difference between Mute and Blade Runner, obviously. Inspired by the look, sure. Inspired by kind of like the deeper meanings of it, not necessarily. I think Mute is not a bad movie. Some people calling that shit watchable, which I think is a little bit disrespectful to Mute. I think it's a solid film that kind of loses whatever it's trying to tell in the process of just like ambition. I think Mute is a visually stunning big world that seems like it has a lot of story to tell. But when you actually go inside the world, you realize that no, it's just a small world that barely has a sentence to kind of really say. I feel like there's a lot of subtleties and a lot of like small background information that kind of makes the world seem like it's a little bit bigger and fills in the gaps of like what this future is. And that's actually one of the best parts of Mute. It actually has a bit of a world built up. I think the problem is the world is big, the characters are small. They feel very, very just small, and they don't feel like they're even fleshed out to the point where they can't even fill up a cup. That's how like drained and like small these characters kind of feel like. And I think this movie is interesting on some aspects, and it fails completely to begin with. There's a lot of times where you're kind of just wondering, is there a purpose to this story? Because it feels like there's some times where this movie is just kind of going on, and it's not necessarily pacing problems, but it just feels like nothing's really happening. You don't really get a sense of like, what do we care for in this movie? And by the time you hit to the end, you understand something of what Duncan Jones tried to actually do, but for some reason, it just takes tremendously long to kind of get to some sort of relevance. Now, this movie, like I said, is not bad. There's actually some highlights in here, like I said, the world building and the visual style, but there's something slightly lacking. Now, I think that having a character be mute and having a character not be, having the lead character not say anything, essentially, can add for a very interesting type of take on a detective noir story. Because obviously there's an internal dialogue essentially from detectives in noir films, but when you have that for a mute character, it doesn't really actually serve that purpose. So you kind of have to do like what an RPG does, which is essentially elevate the character that doesn't say anything and just uses an expression through the supporting cast. Now, the supporting cast itself is not bad. I like Paul Rudd. I like Justin Theroux. I even like the girlfriend for the most part. The problem is the narrative choices that they kind of take with some of these guys. Paul Rudd's fantastic, and he's very funny in this movie and out of it. But the problem is that when he's in the movie, it feels like it's a bit of a tonal shift that I feel like this movie doesn't really understand how to get back to. And when it does get back to it, then it feels like it goes back and forth and feels just like two separate films stuck together with duct tape and maybe a Band-Aid. So it kind of feels a little bit off for the most part. But eventually things kind of connect to the point where, like I said, you understand what's actually happening and what is the purpose of this entire story. Now, like I said, when it comes to narrative choices or, whatever, writing's fine, but I think the relationship between Leo and his girlfriend is not really fleshed out enough. There's small details about it, and there's small details about Leo to kind of make you care a little bit, but they don't really feel like they're that big of a deal to the point where Leo just seems like a blank character, like in an RPG. Like you have background information about him, but for the most part, you're not really getting anything other than that. And you kind of have to fill in the blanks. Now, I kind of hate that in like this movie, and I kind of hate it in like RPG games where, developers say, you got to kind of envision yourself into the character. And I say, that's kind of bullshit. Because then you essentially just want us to do the work for you. essentially. Now, not all the time, but most of the time, it just kind of comes across a little bit lazy. Now, there, like I said, there's small hints of what Leo's background was, how did he get there, but nothing is actually kind of really explained or at least open to interpretation really that much. I feel like there could have been some sort of interesting aspect to kind of tell, what's he thinking for the most part. And they slightly have one, I think, with like a diary, if I remember. But there's not enough of that. And the girlfriend doesn't really seem like she's like a character, more just like a plot device to kind of get the shit going forward. You never understand how does he know this or how does he know that or whatever. But what I did like is that when you have a character that doesn't speak or you have a person that doesn't speak, and some people may understand this, and this is where I kind of connected a little bit with Leo, is that when you're quiet, you kind of analyze a little bit more better, right? You hear people's secrets. People maybe manipulate you. People try to take advantage of you. You kind of feel like a little bit of an outsider. You feel like maybe you're not meant for this time. Maybe you're not a big fan of technology. Maybe you are young, though. I thought those were kind of the interesting thing. And Alexander Skarsgård actually does a good job in the movie physically, but I just feel like emotionally, expressionless or expression-wise, he doesn't really connect that well as like this tortured soul per se. I think he actually does a good job, like I said, physically, and he seems like he kind of is, that guy that's kind of a man apart from everybody. And I think that could be a more interesting aspect to kind of dive into, but it's not a character study per se, or if it is, it's not a very good one. Overall, like I said, I think Mute is a movie that gets by on its visual flair, but the problem is the movie doesn't understand, or at least it feels like it wants to kind of say something, maybe about crime, maybe about parents, maybe about love, but it doesn't understand how to explain that in the world that they have built up here. And so therefore it kind of is just a very visually stunning world that has some information about some things, but you never really go deep enough into a lot of this shit. So therefore you're just kind of left with answers, or actually questions that you'll never get an answer to. Now, you don't need everything explained, I get that, but you have to have some sort of, you have to be on the same page with what the director is trying to aim for, and I feel like you never really get a clear sense of what that is here. Overall, Duncan Jones actually does a good job with some of, the visual stuff, as I said, and, the soundtrack, I think, is actually one of the better parts of the thing, and Paul Rudd is actually great. But Skarsgård, I feel like, could be a little bit miscasted. I feel like they could have got somebody that looked more like an everyday man, somebody that looks like a little bit more of, pardon the term, but like a loser of sorts. I feel like Skarsgård comes across as too pretty. He comes across as a tough guy, but a little bit too pretty. Maybe a generic choice, but like maybe like somebody like Tom Hardy that looks like a bum, but has better expressions on his face. And I feel like that was also the main thing. I didn't really get a sense of what he's thinking with like expressions. I feel like his face is not that expressive, and it kind of threw me off a little bit. Not bad, but just not overly great. But that's my review. I think Mute is a very, like I said, it's a beautiful movie that doesn't really say that much. Now, not everything has to have a deeper meaning, but you actually have to have a purpose of the film. And I feel like though it gets there, and this movie is brutal, it is violent, and it may turn people off, I think overall you can find some probably connection with Leo a bit to kind of get on board. But because Leo's not a fleshed out character at all, and it's not because he's quiet or doesn't say shit, it's just because the movie doesn't do anything to kind of really elevate him. And the supporting cast is not really that great to elevate a character that doesn't speak. And like I said, anybody that played an RPG, your supporting cast has to elevate you. Simply put, look at Dragon Age. Yeah, character don't speak, but those interesting characters around him elevate the shit tremendously. Overall, I think Duncan Jones can actually make a pretty good Mass Effect movie. Even though I kind of was like a little bit mixed on this, I think Duncan Jones can actually make a pretty good Mass Effect movie. But overall, the movie does kind of go back and forth of just like sometimes tonal shifts. But overall, the ambition and the ideas are kind of something that I think people can look for some inspiration through. But other than that, there's nothing really more to say about Mute. Overall, it's an enjoyable movie that you won't regret because it's part of the Netflix package. But if you have to pay for it, you might probably be like, I kind of want a refund. But either way, comment, subscribe, like. I'm Chris Smith. I'm signing out.